Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can I also extend my welcome to what I think is a really important agenda. Neil was talking about feeling untrustworthy, feeling that you're classed as an outsider, as a pariah. Welcome to my life as an MP, I think that's safe to say. Neil's given me 12 minutes, and trying to get an MP to speak for just 12 minutes is an ambitious task. But I, in that time, want to touch upon 5 broad areas for discussion, if I may. I want to answer the exam question first in terms of those drivers for change in the UK, but then I want to expand and push on what the government is doing through its HE reforms in those 5 points. In terms of drivers for change, I think it's very clear that we are going through a huge range of arguably unprecedented change in the sector. There's growing competition globally, there's technology, there's innovation. From a national point of view, it's very clear that higher skills, the knowledge economy, will ensure that that is the route to greater productivity improvements and ultimately rising living standards. The government's white paper is called Success in a Knowledge Economy. That gives you a very clear clue as to where that's going. From a HE institution point of view, there's a lot of challenges. People will need to recruit talent in terms of staff and in terms of students, but they are facing enormous pressures in terms of those well-established models, particularly in the context of Brexit, with regards to 2 key areas. First is about research funding, and the government has committed to look and plug that gap. I think that's going to be very interesting as to whether that happens, and in Parliament we need to scrutinise that closely. I think of more concern is many institutions are very reliant upon international students models, and the rhetoric, both from when Theresa May was Home Secretary, in terms of visa requirements, but also in terms of what has been said even just yesterday following the cabinet meeting at Chequers about Brexit meaning Brexit and very clear restrictions on migration, I think should give cause for concern when it comes to HE. And from the student point of view, and Neil touched upon this, students can now be very discerning, and I hate this word in this context, but I think it's probably applicable, customers. What am I going to get for my substantial investment into my education? What, as Neil said, career, what premium am I going to get out of that? And we'll want very clear information in choosing the course and institution that they want, and also in terms of how they can assess that. So the world is changing. The world is changing fast, and we need to have an HE model that really reflects that to ensure that we can have prosperity on a national as well as on an individual basis. But that brings me on to my second point, which is I find it absolutely fascinating that if we think that the model of catering to a system where students at the age of 18 go to a full-time 3-year degree is somehow out of date, actually, that's still what we have. We still have, despite the remarkable diversity in the HE model, a very clear, almost homogeneous path. Full-time students now constitute a higher proportion of students in higher education than ever before, about 3/4 of all students. That's up from about 60% a decade ago. And 87% of those are studying for a first degree. Under 25s make up 3/4 of all undergraduates. That model hasn't changed much in generations. But what is particularly striking, and I think extremely alarming, is the marked decline in part-time study. Now, we can debate the reasons for that. I don't think we've got time now. You can talk about the decision by the Labour government in 2008-9 to remove for students the funding that's equivalent of a lower qualification study, the trebling of tuition fees by the coalition government. These will all play a part. But what is striking and what's very clear is that since 2010, there's been a decline of about 40% in the numbers of students studying part-time. I think this is a very dear concern for our national offer. If the world of work in the future is going to be that we will change careers, that people will have to upskill, retrain, move from one career path to another. The education system, and particularly higher education system, needs to be attuned to that. And I don't think we have that. If economic success in the 21st century is going to be about flexibility, about resilience, and about adaptability, we need to move to that. And I think that decline in part-time students needs to be addressed in much more of an urgent and comprehensive way than the government has so far suggested. Now, talking of the government, let me mention the government's reforms. Now, there are a number of things in the white paper and in the bill. Massive changes to the regulatory regime in terms of the Office for Students, teaching excellence framework, and social mobility and widening participation. I just want to focus in my contribution on one thing which I find absolutely fascinating, which is new universities, alternative providers. I think these are really interesting. I don't think there should be an objection in principle to the idea of new alternative providers. Now, I can understand some nervousness amongst existing providers. They will see some challenge. They will see maybe inroads into their market share. But historically, expansion of the HE sector, whether it's in the 1820s and 30s, whether it's in terms of the new universities in the 1960s, including the Open University, that's created an enviable, diverse system here in the UK. It's provided quality, it's provided choice that is the envy of the world. And what is to stop such expansion now doing the same thing, especially in the light of the need for part-time study and the need to incorporate greater technology and innovation into our HE offer? That's the government's rationale. But I'm really interested in what sort of new providers will be set up. And I really want to sort of mention three elements of this if I can. The government hasn't really articulated its vision about what the new providers will look like. That's up to the market to decide. Now, will businesses set up new universities? Will you have an AstraZeneca university? Now, what would be the reason for this? What's the rationale? Well, it can be enhancing their brand, their reputation. It can provide the workforce for the future. And in some cases, it provides that logical strategic fit in terms of their current and aspirational business objectives. Pearson is an obvious example of this. It isn't much of a leap to think that the company will want to offer degrees of their own. That makes sense. But I do think it's questionable about whether other companies will want to do this. Will they really want to embark upon becoming a new university when actually greater collaboration and partnership with an existing and valued institution can give them much the same ends for much less risk and cost? So what about start from scratch universities? Somebody just setting up out of the blue with no real track record in terms of delivery quality or in terms of reputation. The government's reforms propose that awarding degree powers should be given to those new universities instantly, virtually straight away, with no track record in education. Now, put yourself in the position of a student, investing tens of thousands of pounds of potential debt, going to a university with no track record. Why would you do that? Why would you run the risk? And why would Britain run the risk of undermining our world-class reputation in HE to do that? I can't see many universities just springing up from scratch. Now, there may be opportunities, and there may be in terms of looking at technology, innovation, distance learning, there may be niches. But I think international experience and indeed our own experience has suggested that start from scratch universities can end in tears. And I think take-up will be small. Now, there may be other parts of civic society that will want to do things. They could be charities, they could be trade unions, growing upon their respective in terms of union learn and things like that. But I do think that take-up is going to be minimal. I think, and one of the things that I don't think has had much coverage, is that where I think there will be alternative providers and new universities in the UK is that foreign universities will come and be awarded degree powers here. I think it's very easy to envisage the likes of Harvard, MIT, Princeton or McGill coming here and establishing what could be a foreign takeover of the HE sector. Now, how HEIs adapt and react to this, I don't think, in my opinion, has been fully thought through. But I think that needs to be considered a real threat to the current situation with regards to HE and new providers. Now, when the government has been encouraging markets deciding alternative providers and new universities, I find it astonishing that they've neglected to really prioritise one obvious way in which that could be provided. And this is my fourth point, and that's the importance of collaboration between HE and FE. Now, I know John might want to say a few words later on, but this is such an obvious, established and innovative part of our education landscape that I can't believe the government doesn't want to emphasise this. There is a disconnect between further and higher education. There's no real synthesis in announcements coming from government. So Neil mentioned about the apprenticeship levy. That seems to stand in very much isolation from what's going on in terms of the reforms when it comes to HE. I think we face a crisis of skills in this country, but I think it's a crisis of technical education rather than changing and having to move higher education. The government talks of degree-level apprenticeships, but recognition and take-up of these qualifications are woefully low. Only 4% of apprenticeship starts are at higher levels. Now, that might change, and the machinery of government with the new Prime Minister might help that, placing further and higher education in that single education ministry. But I'm sceptical of these things. After all, the old Department of Biz had HE and FE together, and there really was that massive disconnect. And I do worry that in a single education ministry, HE and certainly FE will miss out in respect of funding allocation and in terms of ministers' priorities when it comes to schools and perhaps early years. Now, again, Neil mentioned this, but when you have a sector that's already providing 10% of higher education in this country, that's a massive driver of local economic prosperity and in terms of social mobility, I don't know why the government doesn't encourage greater collaboration through its HE reforms in respect of partnering with FE. And the fifth and final point I want to mention is actually what I should have been addressing all the way along, which is that link up between HE and business. There's great instances, great case studies of individual collaborations between institutions and companies. I'm very much interested in manufacturing, and over half of manufacturers have worked with research institutions because they recognise there's huge benefits. They get access to skilled graduates, they get access to talent, they get access to new ideas, and there's that infusion of innovation which is vital for future economic success. So I can see why that happens. However, I do think, and I really want to get your views on this, colleagues, that there's a disconnect as well between our great research institutions, our great HE sector in general, and how that links in to commercialisation and economic growth. We are arguably second in the world when it comes to HE, but we're not the second biggest economic power. That's rather flippant, but I just wonder how else can we be smarter at collaborating between HE and business in order to make sure that that comparative advantage in HE translates directly into economic success. And I just want to finish on this point. There's been a myriad of different reviews announced by government over the years. If you're a new minister, you want to announce something, and you want to announce a new review. So what we've had in respect of the analysis of business and university collaborations, we've had the Wilson Review in 2012, we had the Lambert Review in 2013, we had the Whitty Review in the same year, we had the Dowling Review from last year. My own predecessor committee looked at HE and business. And I think this is a wider point regarding government, not necessarily just confined to HE. Government needs to stop tinkering. Government needs to stop announcing things. The initiative-itis that pervades Whitehall can actually be damaging. I think there needs to be an agreed approach, and of course it will need adapting, but there needs to be an agreed approach, and actually that just needs to be delivered and executed. A period of stability is essential in many aspects of public policy, and I think this is one of them, which is why I think in terms of mentioning yet another review, the nurse review, and the change to research institutions and the risk that that might give to Innovate UK, which has been a great way in bridging the gap between research and commercialising that research into economic success. That's been put under threat. There are big changes going on, ladies and gentlemen. We are facing real change. But I do think in terms of many of the government's reforms, the new government is missing a trick in respect of a lot of things that could be doing in order to make sure that that gap between HE and business can be fully brought together and the real potential can be fully realised. Thank you for your time.
Okay.